So in this video, we'll just introduce the urinary system. Now, when we're talking about the urinary system, we're talking about not only the kidneys, but the whole complete urinary tract. So when we're looking at kidneys, of course, most people are familiar with what they do, is that really they help to filter the blood. So we're removing metabolic waste products and we're modifying the fluid for a number of reasons. So, yeah, we are getting rid of waste products like nitrogenous waste, urea, uric acid, variations of that. But we also are doing fluid and electrolyte homeostasis. The kidneys also have a role when it comes to acid-base balance and blood pressure homeostasis. So there's more to them. And remember, in the past, we have seen the kidneys for some of their functions like the production of erythropoietin, EPO. Now, when we're talking the urinary tract, we're talking about the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the single urethra. And most people are familiar that the kidneys produce urine, and the urinary bladder, which is at the floor of the pelvic cavity, it's stored, and then the urine leaves the body through the urethra. Now, as I said, what do they do? Let's go back to that and just say a bit more. Well, really, the kidneys are really one of the main things in our body that does homeostasis. So yes, we are removing those metabolic wastes. We are helping to regulate fluid and electrolyte balance. And we're regulating the osmolarity of the blood. And we've seen from past chapters why osmolarity is such an important thing in the blood. We conserve or eliminate water and electrolytes. And as I said before, it also has a role in acid-base balance and blood pH. And how does it do that? Well, it's about either keeping or eliminating hydrogen ions or bicarbonate ions as a result. We also have a direct influence on blood pressure because, of course, if we get rid of blood volume, then that will change pressure. And also we have the production of EPO, which has a role in erythropoiesis, which is making red blood cells. And also it has a role in terms of detoxification. It also has a role in activating vitamin D. It's one of the main things. It can have a role in creating new glucose and through the process of what we call gluconeogenesis. Gluco for, of course, glucose, neo for new, and genesis for creation. Now, so you can see there's a number of things that the kidneys do for us. Now, what are they like? Well, they're kidney bean shaped, and I know that seems like kind of very obvious. And they're both both kidneys are outside and posterior to the peritoneal membrane. Now, we haven't done the abdominal cavity in great detail so far, but the peritoneal membrane surrounds some of the organs, some of the tissues within the abdominal cavity, but some things are not enclosed by this membrane. And the kidneys are one of those things that are not enclosed by the peritoneal membrane, and they actually lie behind the peritoneal membrane in the abdominal cavity, so kidneys are quite far back. So we refer to that as retroperitoneal, which means behind the peritoneum. And when we actually look at the kidneys, we'll see that the right kidney is slightly lower than the left. And that's because on the right side, the upper right quadrant, the liver takes up much of the space. Also, let's not forget that the adrenal gland, which is part of the endocrine system, lies on the superior pole of each of the kidneys. Now here we can just see the positioning. We can see here that yes, the right kidney is slightly lower than the left kidney, and that's because this area up here would be occupied by the liver. You can see there's a kidney. You can see it has very good blood supply. A lot of blood goes to the kidneys at rest. And we can see that we have the ureters down to the bladder and then the urethra. And you can see that it's only the upper pole, the upper portion of the kidneys that are protected directly by the ribs. But there is a lot of other tissue that helps to protect the ribs. And we're going to see that The ribs have a number of connective tissues that help to sort of support them and hold them in place. One is the renal fascia, and it's a dense, irregular connective tissue, and it helps to anchor the kidneys within the peritoneum, and also part of the muscles that are in that posterior area. Then deep to that, we have an adipose capsule, very much like bubble wrap, right? So it gives protection from physical shock, and it also helps to hold the kidneys in place. And then as we go further deeper towards the actual kidney tissue, we have the renal capsule, which once again is dense, irregular connective tissue, and it covers each kidney. And this also helps protect against trauma and infection from directly spreading to it. So we can see here in cross-section, here we can see there is the liver, so we're actually sort of looking upwards, looking superior. The stomach, this is the peritoneal membrane that I talked about that envelops much, but not all of the contents. So the peritoneal membrane runs there, and it encloses things in front of it. So the kidneys are retroperitoneal because they are behind this membrane. And we can just see here in this cross-section, first of all, there's the body of the vertebrae, here's the abdominal aorta, and we can see that we have the renal fascia, and then deep to that we have the adipose capsule, which is the fat capsule, and then we have the renal capsule on top of it. So there's a lot that helps to protect the kidneys. In addition, have a look, you can see that maybe the ribs don't come down that far, but there's a lot of musculature that also helps to protect the kidneys from the back and the side. And then, of course, even as we go further out, there's the skin and the adipose tissue and the dermis. So there's a lot of protection for these kidneys. Now, how big is it? Well, each kidney is about 150 grams. Kind of the size of a medium-sized bar of soap, if you want to get an idea. And just like with the lungs, there's a portion called the hilum. And the hilum, or hilus, if you're looking at singular versus plural, is where the renal artery, vein, nerves, and the ureters enter and exit. So everything comes and goes. Very similar concept as in the lungs, that all the plumbing comes and goes from there. And the hilum opens up into an area called the renal sinus. And we'll have a look at that when we get inside. Now, the internal anatomy of the kidneys, most of what we're going to be talking about are structures that we can't see with the naked eye, which would be things like the nephrons. But we can have a look at sort of the big structure, right? And we have a renal cortex, a renal medulla, and an inner renal pelvis. So when I'm talking about the cortex and the medulla, this is the part of the kidney that actually makes the urine, whereas the renal pelvis and all the other structures associated with it are about the urine has been formed, it's either being stored or it's drained from there. Right? Now, the renal cortex has a certain color to it. It's sort of this reddish brown, and that's because it has a lot of blood supply. So the vast majority, like 95% of the blood vessels of the kidney are in the renal cortex. And then we also have these areas called renal columns. Now we're going to have a look at the overview so you can put this all visually into perspective. But we have the renal columns, which are extensions of the renal cortex, and they pass through the renal medulla down towards the pelvis. And this is where we have things like the renal artery travels through to get to the outer cortex. And then we also have the nephrons, and we'll come back and talk about the nephrons. The nephrons are really where we do the filtration. And the nephrons have basically a renal corpuscle, and attached to that is the long renal tube, which has the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of the nephron, and the distal convoluted tubule. And we're also going to see that we have these things called renal pyramids that are located within the renal medulla. So let's hop ahead and let's have a look at the cross-section. So most of what we want to talk about in this chapter is microscopic, and that is the nephron. So we can't actually see an individual nephron. But what I did is sort of draw a sort of an idea of sort of where the nephrons would be, just as a perspective. But we wouldn't see this with the naked eye. But let's have a look. So here in a section, we can see that we have the renal cortex. The renal cortex is the material out here. Right? And then deep to that, we have the renal medulla. And the renal medulla has two parts. The renal pyramids. Now, someone had pretty good imagination because they thought this looked pyramid. All these look pyramid shape. So they became called the renal pyramids. And that is part of the renal medulla. Now, if you notice, here's a pyramid, there's one, etc., etc. If you look, in between each pyramid is a renal column. And so both the renal pyramid and the renal column make up the medulla. So it's within here that we see parts of the nephron and also the collecting ducts, which we'll talk about later. So it's in the nephrons where I take filtrate from blood and I'm going to turn it into urine. Now, the fluid is basically going to flow in this direction out to this point. When the fluid reaches the end, there's opening, and by the way, there's millions of these nephrons. Okay. So when the fluid reaches the end, it is urine. It's not, once it gets here, it's not going to change again. So this first little open area that receives the urine is going to be called the minor calyx. So there's a bunch of minor calyxes here. Okay? And then where the minor calyxes, a group of minor calyxes meet, that area is going to be the major calyx. And so there's a whole number of minor calyxes, and then we have some major calyxes, and then all the fluid will go from the minor to the major. Now you see there's no barrier, there's no valves or anything, it's just a straight flow through into the big open area here, which is the renal pelvis. And then coming off the renal pelvis, we have the ureter that heads down. So those are the basic structures that we can see. Now let's just zoom in and let's just have a look at this nephron. And we're not going to do the nephron in great detail in this video. This is just a bit of an introduction. But you can see that most of the nephron is up here in the renal cortex, that only a part of the nephron actually dips down, and that would be the loop. Now, if you look carefully, you do notice that there seems to be some nephrons with a short loop that only just goes down into the renal medulla, and some that have a very long loop that really goes down deep into that renal medulla. Now, I'm going to tell you something about this medulla, about what the interstitial fluid's like, is that the deeper you go into the medulla, okay, the greater the osmotic gradient becomes. Now, I write sodium here, but there's other ions. But so let's say the sodium level here it's present in the fluid, but the deeper I go, the saltier it gets. Now, that's going to be important to understand the workings of the loop of the nephron, which we'll talk about in future videos. So I just want to do a quick introduction to the renal system, the urinary system, and talk about some of the basic anatomy.